على سيدنا ونبينا محمد ذي القدر العظيم وعلى آله وأصحابه وأتباعه إلى يوم الدين. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل وألهمنا رشدنا يا رب العالمين. اللهم لك الحمد على ما أنعمت علينا من نعم لا تحصى يا رب العالمين. Alhamdulillah, in our lessons on the Mukhtasar of Imam al-Quduri, in the section on transactions, we have reached the chapter on ijara and on hire or rent. And the author now will tell us that al-ujara'u ala darbain, that people who can be hired are of two types. That you have ajirun mushtarak and ajirun khas. And you can see in the Majalla and Murshid al-Hayran useful points on this. And I would request that we compile a document from, it's a good practice from the Majalla on the key principles related to the Ajir Khas and the Ajir Mushtarak. So you can have someone who's a shared hire, right? A shared hire. The Majalla in item 200, this might actually be from Murshid al-Hayran, item number 222. Yeah, so just check. I'm pretty sure it's because Majalla item 222 would be within. As you know, I'm bad with. So just you check item 222 there. I'll look at 422 because I know myself. I'm not good with numbers. Yes, 422. Alhamdulillah. Yeah. So, right? So, there's the Ajir al-Mushtarak and the Ajir al-Khas. A shared hire and a specific hire or a private hire. So the Ajir Mushtarak, right, is so the Khas, right? If we look at the Khas first, right? The Ajir al-Khas, the specific hire is, defined in item 422 of the Majalla. هو الذي استؤجر على أن يعمل للمستأجر فقط. Someone who's been hired to work only for the person hiring them, right? كالخادم والموظف, such as a servant or an employee, meaning a full-time employee. They're only supposed to be working for them, and there's rulings related to that. And the Ajir al-Mushtarak, right, is someone someone who's been hired to provide a particular service. They're not only working for that person. Right? They're not only working for that person. Like a tailor, for example, whom you hired to make something for you, or you hired someone to... Now the tricky thing is, the same job, depending on how it's defined, could be an ajir khas or an ajir mushtarak, depending on how you set it up. Right? So for example, you hired someone to paint your house, and this comes up a lot in construction. What do a lot of construction companies do? They go and dabble a little bit here, and they go dabble a little bit there, dabble a little bit there, and it's not clear. Are they being hired? Like, what are the terms of the hire? Right? And it's also the case, you get what you pay for, right? If you hired them just for the work, then unless you agreed how the work will be done and the parameters, then you kind of have to blame yourself too, right? So the one who's working full time, the rules differ, right? Because let's say the tailor, like if you imagine two separate things, there's two tailors. So Shaykh Yusuf and I decided to go into clothing. Okay, Shaykh Yusuf got hired because he's a better tailor. Got hired as a full-time tailor. He shows up, but they didn't give him any work. Right? I showed up, but didn't get any work done. Two separate places. Right? The ajir khas is paid differently, because they're paid not for actual work, but for freeing themselves up to do the work. Right? Conceptually, you see the difference. Like there's a tailor, even if they're working for someone else, right? They're hired by different people to stitch sets of clothing. When do they get paid? When they've done the work. Right? If I give a jacket for someone to sew, can they say, okay, I've begun sewing it, I've done 10%, give me 10% of my pay? No, because they're being paid for the work. Right? So this is where there's difference between the two. Right? So he tells us فالمشترك, right? The shared hire, من لا يستحق الأجرة حتى يعمل, is the one who does not deserve to be paid until they've worked. Right? Why? Because he doesn't give a definition. Imam Quduri doesn't define it directly, but he tells us about its consequence. Because al-ajir al-mushtarak, they're shared between different people. So you're not working for anybody in specific. That's why the commentator says, يَعْمَلْ لَا لِوَاحِدٍ. They're working not for one person. This is a bit of a broad definition, because within the time of your work, you could be an ajir khas part-time. It's not necessarily a full-time thing. How? Someone is a designer. So they work during the day, 30 hours a week for company A, for sister entrepreneur. And in the evening, they work for Hamza Nightly Designs, right? HND. Because see, Hamza discovered that a lot of companies need design work at night. A lot of companies need design work at night, and people don't want to work with people from all over the world. So he's going to set up a design company over here where he can deal with clients in evening time. Okay, ahlan wa sahlan. So while someone is working during the day for one person, during that time they're being hired for what? To free themselves up to work. Right? So at that time they're ajir khas within those parameters. And they have certain things that govern them during that time. What is the person responsible for there? Is التمكن من العمل. They are ready to work. As opposed to the ajir, like a tailor or someone who's providing a service, right? I'd like you to paint my house. The person says, sure, on Saturday. So they came up and they didn't ring the doorbell. Said, pay me? No, because they're getting paid for the work itself, right? One of the reasons Imam Quduri doesn't really give a thorough definition of it, because the cases of the ajir khas and the ajir mushtarak are many. But conceptually, the ajir khas, during the specified work, they're working for that person only, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be full-time, right? Whereas the ajir mushtarak is being hired for the work itself. For the work itself. Right? So ajir al-mushtarak, they're called mushtarak bi'atibar al-ghalib. In the general case, that someone in that scenario would be working for different people, typically. But it could be one person, but their pay is not connected to time, it's connected to work. How? So let's say Shaykh Yusuf and I decide, look, why don't we partner and start up a tailoring services company, right? We got more important things to do, right? Like we got tempted by dunya, but we said no, forget tailoring. We'll start inspired by Imam Abu Hanifa, we started a tailoring services company. So we hire all of you to tailor on our behalf. So we take contracts for tailoring and we pay you on a piecemeal basis. But you got so much work that you're working 50 hours a week. But did we hire you for 50 hours a week? No. We hired you per item, for example. That would be considered an ajir mushtarak, right? So that's why the definition, من يعمل لا لواحد, the one who acts, who works not for just one person, أو لواحد من غير توقيت, or works for more than one person without time limit. Why? Because the ajir mushtarak, the main thing is that they are working they're hired for the work itself, not for the time itself, right? So فالمشترك لا يستحق الأجرة حتى يعمل. So the ajir al-mushtarak does not deserve pay until they work, until they do the work. Right? Because the ma'qud alayhi, what is the terms? What are they being hired for? Here they're being hired for the work. If you don't do it, you didn't do. Because ujra is aqd mu'awada. And you can see this discussion in Hashd ibn Abdin, volume 5, page 40. لأن الإجارة معاوضة. The hire is a contract of exchange. One party, what is one party offering? Specified work. The other party is giving the pay, right? Whereas in the ajir al-khas, what are they providing? They're giving their time. And why is that important? To give a real life scenario, one of my friends, he's a Jordanian scholar, when he moved to our neighborhood, he was totally broke. A lot of visitors would come to the neighborhood, and they'd set up classes with him. But people were coming for vacations, so they'd keep canceling his classes. So month after month, he'd be broke. So I sat him down. I said, what's going on? He said, I'm booked up all the time, but I don't make money. I said, why? Because what would happen is, he'd have a full schedule of classes. Someone's going to the Dead Sea, someone's going here, someone's going there. When you set up a class with somebody, what did you hire them for? For that time. So in that time, what are they? They're ajir khas, right? Because they're being hired for the time, not for the work, right? You could hire them to cover a book with you, for example, right? Let's say Arabic language, right? Then that's they're being hired for a service, not for the work. And we'll see the fiqh of it in the ajir khas. In that kind of situation, it also protects the right of the person being hired. It protects both parties' rights. So we'll see the implications of that. So the ajir mushtarak, right? لا يستحق الأجرة حتى يعمل. They don't deserve their pay until they've worked. حتى يعمل المعقود عليه, until they do what was agreed to. Because if you do something else, you didn't do the work, right? And that also comes up. Contracts are by what was agreed upon. I was in Pakistan at this one madrasa. They worked by tenders. Like when they had a big contract, they put it up. So one tender was won by one of the scholars, because he'd started a company. It was for some supplies. And he went. He said, are you sure you can fulfill this tender? Because he gave the best price. And he said, we are very specific on what we want to be provided. He said, yes. He said, we want exactly these things. So and there was like several hundred items that they had to procure. The person brought several hundred items, but everything of a slightly lower grade than what was agreed upon. So the head of the madrasa said, let's be fair, but firm. I was sitting in the room when they're having this discussion, very insightful. Anything that is materially equivalent or equivalent in quality, let's accept it. That was only like about 20-25% of the things. Everything else was of lower material value and lower quality. So if neither is there, we will not accept it. And that was 75% of a contract, probably in the tens of thousands of dollars. Or let's say thousands of dollars. So Maulana made a lot of noise and this and that. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu awfu bil uqud. Oh, you believe? Fulfill your contracts. Right? If I hire, let's say, if entrepreneur sister hired Sister Lola to work as a receptionist at her company. She came in and saw the toilets were dirty. So she spent all day cleaning the toilets and there's no one serving as a receptionist. Can she demand pay from you? No. Because she didn't do the specific work. Right? You hired a tailor to do, but the ajir al-mushtarak does not deserve pay unless they do the work that was contractually agreed upon. The contractually agreed upon portion applies in both, except that in one, they have to do the work contractually agreed upon. In the other, they have to, الشرط هو التمكن. They make themselves available to do the work that was agreed upon. And so he gives example, كالصباغ والقصار, right? Such as the one who dyes clothing, or the qassar is the one who bleaches clothing, right? And the like of them. Different people give them the work, right? Now, he's looking at the fiqh, so let's take the scenario of the tailor. I gave cloth to the tailor. When do they deserve to get paid? When they finish the work. What happens? So I give the cloth to the tailor. What is the ruling of that cloth in the tailor's hand? He tells us, وَالْمَتَاعُ أَمَانَةٌ فِي يَدِهِ. The item given is a trust in their hand. إِنْ هَلَكَ لَمْ يَضْمَنْ شَيْئًا. If it perishes in their hand, this is مِنْ غَيْرِ تَعَدٍ, without any transgression. Right? أو تقصير, or negligence. At night, they closed the shop but they didn't lock the door. Someone came and took the item. That's considered taqsir. Because is it reasonable practice that you close your shop and not lock the door? No. But you locked your shop, someone broke in. You don't have to compensate for it, right? عند أبي حنيفة. This is according to Abu Hanifa. Even if you made a condition that you are fully liable for this, because هذا شرط لا يقتضيه العقد. The Sahibain disagreed on this, right? Right? That no, you have to compensate for it, except for something that overwhelms, like a general fire, right? Or the city got overrun by the enemy or something like that. The fatwa position, according to most of the later scholars, was on the position of Imam Abu Hanifa, right? And that's what's mentioned by, so the author of the Lubab mentions that legally the position of Abu Hanifa is stronger, right? Right? And this is what's chosen in the mutun, and that's the madhab. That's also what's mentioned in Tanwir al-Absar. However, okay, and this is a little exercise for you guys. What does the Majalla choose on this point? Right, you'll find it floating around, inshallah. The Al-Maydani quotes, لكن في الدر, right? That the later scholars said that the fatwa would be that يعني أفتى المتأخرون بالصلح على نصف القيمة. That because this leads to a lot. But what's the problem that the later scholars had to deal with? That the yad of the worker is the yad of amana. The ulama said people don't have amana. You give someone something, they didn't take care of it and they lost it. Then what happens? There's fight. Ta'addi, la, no, this, prove this, and it becomes. So he said, as-sulhu khair. So this is so in itself, legally, the strong position is the position of Abu Hanifa. But they said that right? That you make sulh, that you settle on half the price, right? Right? And others said no, but there's a lot of discussion in fatwa about this, right? So fiqh wise, the position is it's amana. The principle of amana, when do you compensate for an amana? If there's ta'addi or taqsir, if there's transgression or negligence. But so it quotes from the Fusul al-Imadiyya. It's an important book in the Hanafi school. That وقيل that if the person hired كان مصلحا, right? They're someone who is trustworthy and responsible, they wouldn't have to compensate, right? And if they're an irresponsible person, then they would be, they would be liable. And if we don't know about their state, then they're asked to settle, to solve disputes. Right? Okay. Right? Right? Now, well, then it says in the وما تلف بعمله كتحريق الثوب من دقه وزلق الحمال وانقطاع الحبل الذي يشد به المكاري الجمل أو الحمل وغرق السفينة من مدها مضمون. Right? Right? And that which is ruined due to their work. Right? So one, if there's a difference between mahalaka, that which is destroyed in their property, in their hand, that's the first case. Here, that which perishes as a result of their action. Right? Such as burning the cloth. Right? As they're tailoring and they burnt the cloth from their actions. And this is وَلَوْ مِنْ غَيْرِ قَصْدٍ, non-deliberately. Right? Or the one who the hammal is the one who's carrying something, they slipped and the thing broke. And they mentioned different scenarios of that. So one of the few times I ever saw Shaykh Abdul Razak al-Halabi laugh in a class on the Kitab al-Ujra, because there's several funny scenarios mentioned in Hashid ibn Abdin. He laughed, but like for maybe 3 seconds. And then he was back to being scarily sober. Or the one who rented out some mode of transport, that was tied down by ropes. If the rope broke, and therefore the item that was being hired to be transported, for example, perished. Or someone rented out a ship to carry things, and the ship drowned. Here there's compensation. And the reasoning mentioned in Hashid ibn Abdin is because what are you being hired for? Yeah. But what is the job? It's a manfa'a. Because Ibn Abdin says, لا يستحق الأجرة لأنه ما أوفى بالمنفعة. He's not deserving of the rent, because the rent here is for the manfa'a. Because what's the principle? The ajiz al-mushtarak, they're being hired to do some work. Right? So here he didn't get the work done. Right? The manfa'a that was sought in the contract did not happen. Bal al-madarra, rather harm arose from their action. So there's daman in there. Right? إلا أنه لا يضمن به بني آدم ممن غرق في السفينة. However, you don't have to compensate for any human beings who drown. right? أو سقط من الدابة, or if a human being died out of falling from the animal, right? Because there the fuqaha deemed that the service was not to carry the human being, was carrying. The death of the human being is considered the life and death of the human being is considered outside of the contract. Right? And also because human lives are expensive, right? Like compensation for them, we'll see in the chapters related to that. وَإِذَا فَصَدَ الْفَصَّادِ. What's fasd? Yeah, it's like cauterizing a vein, right? Right? This, of course, with permission. Someone went to get a vein cauterized. أو نزع البزاغ أو بزغ البزاغ. Who's a bazagh? Yeah, right? Yeah, someone who's doing some kind of surgery. ولم يتجاوز الموضع المعتاد, and they don't go beyond the normal procedure, right? فلا ضمان عليه فيما عطب من ذلك. There's no compensation due on them in any harm that arises from that. This is sort of very general. There's a lot of fiqh classically with respect to the work of the one who did cauterizing, or the one who did hijama, or the one who did surgery, someone who removed a tooth, and they developed a whole fiqh around the different possibilities and what is considered, and to what extent, and what is the fiqh around that. A number of the issues related to this are in the Majalla, but in general, if they acted within al-mu'tad, within what al-ma'zoon wal-mu'tad, between what there is permission for, right, and what is customarily accepted, there's no compensation for it. But if they were they're negligent, or they were excessive, they decided to do a little extra, then there would be compensation for that, right? Fiqh related to the shared hire, and then he'll tell us about al-ajir al-khas, the specific hire, and we'll look at that after Maghrib. So we'll be back in 10 minutes. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. Yeah, they're next to each other. Okay. So in the case, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the case of so if we summarize the rulings related to the shared hire, right? The shared hire is somebody who has been, conceptually just like the contractor, right? They've been hired, but don't think of them as an employee and a hire, in that the primary thing about the ajir khas, right? The personal hire, about that distinguishes the ajir mushtarak, the shared hire, is that they've been hired to do some particular work. So typically they do that work for different people. It's very possible that they could be doing it for one person, but they've just been hired to do work. Most workers don't like that. Why? Because work comes and goes. So if I freed up my time, right? Because what can people do? So okay, you're working full time for me, but I'm going to pay you by the work you get. I don't send you work, then you get paid. So would someone want to do that? So typically they'd want to branch out because they're a non-passive agent, right? They get paid for their work. Anything that the item that they're handling that belongs to the one who hired them is an amana. It's only compensated, according to the fatwa position, if there's transgression, according to the relied upon position. In giving fatwa, some of the later scholars said no, because there's so much dispute that happens. You give cloth to the tailor, they ruin it, etc. People aren't trustworthy. So they say, well, go to a trustworthy person. So you can't find trustworthy people, right? So that became a problem. But then they said that also depends on urf, on custom, right? On custom. But if someone dies as a result of the action, that's non-deliberate, right? So then if something is ruined from their work, they have to compensate for which was the direct result of their work, right? So they're ironing the cloth and they made holes in the cloth. They have to compensate for that, right? And the other examples given. But if somebody dies from their, like if a human being drowns or they fall from the animal and they die, they don't have to compensate for the human life, right? Because the compensation for that is very high, unless it goes beyond into the situation of criminal negligence. I just made some tea. Just pour it. Okay. So this is the ajir al-mushtarak. Here, of course, it is very clear to define clearly what the work is, right? To define very clearly what the work is, so that a person isn't wronged, right? They thought, I just have to show up, but they didn't get the work done, etc. And it's very important for Muslims when they start businesses and stuff to work to contracts, right? Or at the very least have a clear offer letter, like this is what I'm getting you to do. They agree to the terms. If the purpose of studying fiqh is not just to be sophisticated, but to act on knowledge, so that we agree not only on terms, it's recommended to build into your contract the relevant consequences, right? The most important thing to specify in a contract is not just what we agree upon, but what happens if we disagree. In the sense that, what if the item perishes, right? So let's say I'm a tailor. I'm taking precious cloth from you, right? Now, someone gives me precious cloth, I'm tailoring, it gets stolen. Am I liable or not? Now the wealthy person would say, of course you're liable, it's my cloth and blah, blah, blah. For the tailor, that may be a huge expense. So that's why one should take contracts seriously. Right? One should take contracts seriously, particularly things that are of material significance. Right? And if one starts any work, right, it's rare that Muslims now go to fuqaha, to ulama, to properly work through their contracts. Right? Sometimes people get the idea, they're about to start their business, okay, I'm starting on Monday, can you just look over my contracts? And they've got like 20 contracts and it's like the weekend. Okay? But you spend months, adjusting the font sizes on your website and stuff. But these are significant matters. So that's something worthy of attention. Bi'idhnillah. Omar, just pour it over here, yeah? Just bring it with you. Good.
If someone is working for a company, like a nurse working for a clinic, can that nurse do pro bono work elsewhere for the same type of work?
So that's the ajir khas. That's what we're going to look at next.
Like if they're not working.
So let's look at the ajir khas, right? Right. Just tell him to bring it here. We can pour it from here. Bismillah. Okay. والأجير الخاص, right, and the specific hire, and this is also called أجير واحد, right? Someone's hired by one person, right? الذي يستحق الأجرة بتسليم نفسه في المدة, right? The personal hire is the one who is deserving of pay for making themselves available to work in the specified time. So they're ajir khas in the time that they're working, in the time period where they're working, right? وَإِن لَمْ يَعْمَلْ, even if they don't actually work, right? Even if they don't actually work. Now you don't have, typically somebody would, people have a certain customary capacity, right? So you only have to specify that in the manner that is customarily specified, right? So do you need to specify the hours, etc.? No. If not specified, it goes back to al-mu'tad, what is customarily expected. So, because sometimes it's hard, right? Some work, for example, someone gets hired as an imam, and assuming sound custom, we don't have sound custom. The problem, of course, with contracts arises is that people don't have, often there isn't a good urf in things. Right? Someone's hired as a full-time imam. They're not working 9 to 5 because, let's say, in the summers, Asr, Maghrib, Isha are all after 5. Right? But they're also expected to be there on the weekends, etc. So what is the contract? Right? What is the contract? Right? Where you're full-time. Contractually, you need to specify things in a manner that is just for both parties, that defines what they're being hired for and how that will play out. Right? And it's important also, so the one being hired, it's their right and not fulfilling your own right, not taking the means of fulfilling to get your own right is makruh. It's disliked. Right? But for the other party, it's recommended to take care of at least the basic interests of the other party. Right? Because in many work scenarios, like hiring an imam, like is it really a realistic work expectation that the person be there for all 5 prayers, 7 days a week, plus the khutbah, plus all these other expectations? And if you just look at the job description of an imam, to give an example, that's not a realistic job expectation, right? Because what's the definition of full-time, etc.? The urf that counts there would be the broader urf. What is full-time? 40 hours a week, let's say, or whatever it is, depending on where you live, right? These things are of consideration, right? Actual work, in the actual, the amount of work that needs to be put in, etc. So those things have to be considered. But at the same time, the opposite is also true, in that someone gets hired full time, but they don't put in anywhere near full time work, right? Or the equivalent of full time work is expected of them, but they don't do it. That's also problematic. That's also problematic because you're not fulfilling your contract. Right? And these are tests of basic taqwa, right? And this in a modern economy, in a 21st century economy, these are also very significant. Why? Because a lot of people work with flexible hours, with flexible location. Right? So there, this gets very sensitive. Right? This gets very sensitive. And which is why those underlying values of amana, of fulfilling the trust, you are being entrusted to do full-time work. Let's say it's only taking you 22 hours. Falsely saying that you did 40 hours is khiyana, is deception. Many people, they're hired to do the work, but say, you know what? I hired, Zubair, who's a really good tailor, for him to tailor, but he subcontracts to all these tailors all over the place. Okay? And he just does some final stitches, like he has, like some final stitches, and he, Now, unless that's clear in the contract, right? Of course, both parties, if you expect him to do it, then you should ask. But it's from amana that they disclose that it'll be done by myself or people working under me. So those kinds of things, because they do lead to dispute, and there's 2 key concepts here. One is amana, fulfilling what you've been entrusted with in the contract, and number 2 is nusх, taking care of the best interests of, or at least the basic interests of the other party, right? Not wronging the other party is haram, is obligatory. Harming them is haram. Not taking into account what's be good for them is makruh. And the Prophet ﷺ said, and it applies to sales, but also applies to hire, that if both parties, right, are true, if they are either, if they both have sidq, sadaqah, wa nasaha, and they both have nusх, they both take care of each other's, have sincere concern for the good of one another, burika lahuma fi bay'atihima, then their transaction will be blessed. And to the extent that they're not, musihat al-barakah, right? Barakah will be wiped out from that transaction. So the أجير الخاص الذي يستحق الأجرة بتسليم نفسه في المدة, they deserve their pay for making themselves available during the time. وَإِن لَمْ يَعْمَلْ, even if they didn't do the work, right? But so the condition is that they make themselves available. That they make themselves available. Right? Otherwise, they don't, they don't deserve, pay for that. Right? Let's mention the Durr al-Muntaqa. كمن استؤجر شهرا للخدمة, such as someone being hired a month as a servant, أو لرعي الغنم, or to graze the sheep. Right? So the work is known, it's understood to be, they're considered to be employed, and the details, they say المطلق ينصرف إلى المعتاد. The unconditioned is referred to what is customary. When do sheep graze? There's typical timings, etc. And they can agree on the details after, but it is superior to specify these so that there's no right? Dispute. Now, one way of making clear that this is an exclusive hire is by specification. If you make the condition that I'm hiring you for a month to do this, with the condition that you're not working for other than me, right? Right? And that would be a binding condition, right? The other and if that is specified, then you cannot work for others. Then you cannot work for others. The other component is that that within, if time is specified, so you can specify exclusivity, that's a binding thing. You hired a designer, you want because it's not just about time, but it's also about their focus and attention and so on. Or if you specify time, that you're working full time, this is the time that you're working for me, right? So you specify either 9 to 5, 5 days a week, or you specify, 60% is fixed hours, this much flex time. Then outside of that, if you don't define exclusivity, then can a person work elsewhere or not? It returns to urf. It returns to custom. Where it's customarily considered reasonable and where it's not considered customarily reasonable. But to avoid dispute, it's best to specify those things within a contract. And he says, وَلَا ضَمَانَ عَلَى الْأَجِيرِ الْخَاصِ فِي مَا تَلِفَ فِي يَدِهِ. Right? There is no compensation due on the Ajir al-Khas, on the private hire, for that which is ruined as a result of their work. Right? Including the cases that are mentioned there, that the cloth got burnt, the item being transported fell, the ship drowned, etc. وَلَا مَا تَلِفَ مِنْ عَمَلِهِ, or nor that, so not something that's ruined in their hand, nor anything that was ruined as a result of their work. Right? So they were given a computer to use, and the computer to repair, for example, and the computer fried. They're given something to transport, and it broke. Illa بالتعدي. So as long as their work was within the bounds of what is acceptable, and there was no ta'addi or taqsir, there was no transgression or remissness. Right? So this is a simple distinction between the two. Then he tells us, وَالْإِجَارَ يُفْسِدُهَا الشُّرُوط كَمَا يُفْسِدُ الْبَيْعَ. Right? Ijara contracts are corrupted by conditions, meaning by impermissible conditions. Right? Just as impermissible conditions corrupt sales contracts. So when are conditions not allowed? What kind of conditions are not allowed?
Any condition that entails a benefit for one of the two contracting parties that isn't directly entailed by the contract.
This third proviso, unless
It's like implied by the.
unless it's customarily acceptable. So in general, what conditions are allowed? So there's conditions that there's no that are not entailed. That there's conditions that are ignored, right? So someone says, "I'm selling you my cow on condition that you keep it happy." Is this anything related to the contract? No, right? That's not binding. And some conditions are just ignored. That they have nothing to do with the subject matter of the transaction. So I'm selling you my cow on condition that you'll never slaughter it ever again. It's ignored, right? It's ignored because that's not related to the contract at all, right? And there's no material benefit to either party, right? There's conditions that are ignored. But conditions of consequence are acceptable conditions are those that are either confirming the contract, right? So if you're filling in the details of the contract, or securing the contract, such as having a guarantor or collateral, etc. So they're clarifying or confirming the contract. Or that are customarily stipulated. The like of this contract condition is customarily stipulated and it does not lead to harm. Right? So it's a sound custom. Same thing applies and what's not allowed is a condition in which there's a material benefit for either party that is not already entailed by the contract, right? And it's not customarily made. Such as what? Such as, imagine if I sold you my coffee maker on condition that I can come and use it whenever I want. Is that a condition that is customarily made? No. The default would be that this corrupts the whole contract, right? This causes problems though, right? Because then a lot of people make all kinds of wacky contracts. A lot of the later scholars' inclination was you ignore that condition. It's not binding. Okay? And a lot of conditions are made, and the reason this is important, I don't want to go into too many details, but there's a lot of tricky things that come up in many industries, and people ask these questions. There's many kinds of conditions that are made that are over the top. For a while, it was very popular to have lengthy non-compete clauses. And now most of those have been dismissed by courts, right? That if you work for me, then you can't work in the same country or the same industry for the next 5 years. So what do you want them to do? Die? Right? Someone's a tailor, you can't work as a tailor in the same country. What, you want them to migrate? That's. But if you deem the whole contract corrupt, that's also a serious problem. That's something that's a fatwa question. Let's sort of keep a question mark on that. That beyond the scope of our class. But generally, the inclination has been to deem the condition corrupt and to separate that from the contract itself. To validate contracts to the extent possible. That was like the contract sound. This is an unfortunate detail, but we keep it separate from the contract. But if they ask, we tell them, look, you guys have to drop the condition. Because otherwise, so many contracts would be deemed just straight up sinful for all kinds of things. Okay. ومن استأجر عبدا للخدمة فليس له أن يسافر به إلا أن يشترط ذلك. If one hires a slave for service, so this is a fortiori, because if someone else's slave, you hired them for service, you cannot travel with them unless that was contractually stipulated. A fortiori would apply to a free person. You hired somebody and they were resident and they're not known to travel. And the nature, of course, and the other is, right? وليس العمل مما يعتاد فيه السفر. And the work is work that you don't customarily travel for, right? Because if you hire someone to work in, you're in a field where you ask 10 people, you say, yeah, it's normal that you'd have to travel. Then within what's reasonable, you would be expected to travel. Right? You hired a designer. Now you say, okay, come with us on our speaking tour. Why? Because we want to showcase our designer. They don't have to agree to that. Do designers typically travel? No, unless it was contractually agreed upon, right? So, if the person was resident and they're not known to travel, and the third condition is, and the work isn't that which you customarily travel for. You hired a sales representative to serve the Southern Ontario region. Then it's implicitly known that you have to travel. So, no, I'm not going to leave the GTA. That's not. In court, that would not be accepted, right? ومن استأجر جملا ليحمل عليه محملا وراكبين إلى مكة جاز وله الحمل المعتاد. If someone hires a camel to carry on it, it's a mahmil, a certain amount of things, and 2 riders to Mecca, for example. This is valid, and what is allowed is that which is within the context of what is customary. Right? Even if you didn't specify exactly how much you're carrying, right? Because a camel can carry a lot of weight. So say 2 riders and some belongings, right? Or some carriage. And what was accepted is what is considered to be mu'tad. And that's where in all societies there have been standards. In Muslim society it's called ihtisab or hisbah. They will put standards that in this is the standard that's acceptable, etc. And that's required across the board, right? To have ihtisab so that undue demands are not made, right? وإن شاهد الجمال المحمل فهو أجود. But if the one in شاهد الجمال, if the camel owner sees what will be carried, right? If they see it or it's specified, right? Right? إن شاهد الجمال المحمل أو عين, or if it's specified, right? فهو أجود, then that's better, because it's further from non-definition, jahala. And if there's sufficient non-definition, it can corrupt the contract. And the corrupt contract has a worldly harm in that it can lead to dispute, and it has a moral harm in that it is sinful. وإن استأجر بعيرا ليحمل عليه مقدارا من الزاد فأكل منه في الطريق جاز له أن يرد عوض ما أكل. Right? Okay, so there's two things here. So he says, if one hire, what's a ba'ir?
So, a camel or a wild ass?
What's the general usage for it? Camel. Right? Right? If someone hires a camel to carry a certain amount of provision on it, on the camel, right? And the one hired eats some of it during the journey, it is valid for them to return the extent of what they ate. But the act of eating itself would be khilaf al-amana, right? Right? Because it's an amana in your hand. Unless you have permission for it, of course, an important thing to keep in mind is الضرورات خارجة عن قواعد الشرع. That أو حالات الضرورة, right? It's mentioned in Qadi Khan that cases of necessity are exempt from the general principle of the Sharia. Someone's about to die, but they're carrying a tanker of water. Even if the person whose water it is says, no, you can't drink it, you can drink it to save your life, you just have to compensate them for it afterwards. Right? But, because what's the legal problem here? Let's say we hired, Global Sister Enterprises, they've grown, GSE, right? She has some people working for her who transport things. So you're transporting 1,000 kilos of the world's best chocolate. Right? On the way, the driver got tempted because it's such nice chocolate. They ate some of it, but they're supposed to carry it from Montreal to Toronto. They ate some chocolate in Kingston. Right? They ate 10 kilos of the chocolate. Right? 10 kilos. I mean, they stopped for 4 days and they just ate chocolate. And it wasn't, let's say it was 100 kilos. They ate 10% of the chocolate. Now they had to transport 100 kilos of chocolate, highly premium chocolate. It was worth just being transported individually from Montreal to Toronto. In Kingston, Ontario, they ate 10 kilos. They had to transport 100 kilos the whole way. Now from Kingston on, you're only transporting 90 kilos. So do you have to compensate for the fact that you carried less for that period? No. All you have to do is to deliver, either you give the 10 kilos of chocolate that you ate, you give the same thing. It's also available in the market. You gave 10 kilos. But you'd have to disclose that. Or you give the material value. Right? يُدَّ عِوَضَ مَا أَكَلْ. You have to give the iwad in exchange for what you ate. But not for the transportational value. Because your duty was to deliver it. Right? And it's considered delivered if you deliver the equivalent of it. Or where it's something unique, the material value. But that's in terms of just the contract itself. The fact that this was an amana in your hand, that act outside the case of necessity would be considered sinful. Right? Because the amana is very serious. So for example, if you have your wallet, let's say, and people make mistakes on amanas, and some of these issues don't come directly in the text, but they deserve mention. That let's say I gave $50. Okay, so I gave $500 to give to Umar, right? And someone puts it in their wallet. Can they say? And on the way they decided to invite their friends for steak. Can they take that money and say, well, I have money in the account, I'll take it back from that? The answer is no. Right? That money itself is an amana, you can't touch it. Right? And that people make mistakes about all the time. Right? Because that actual money itself, and money, for example, that's amana, it's not, you're not permitted to mix it with your own money, because that's istihlak. Right? So someone gave you $500, unless you ask for permission. If you ask for permission that, can I just deposit it in my bank account here? I'll withdraw $500 when I get to Turkey and give it to them there. They gave you permission, that's fine. Right? Then you're morally responsible to ensure that you have that amount of money at the destination. Right? But without that, it's not allowed. Now, if you took $500 of someone else's money and you put it with your money, what's happened to their money? You've mixed someone else's property with your property. That's sinful. Because you could forget, something could happen to your property, a lot of things could happen. Should not be done. Where you need to do that for some reason, you have to ask for permission. And it's even more grave when it's with public funds. With public funds, one has to be extremely careful. Right? Then he tells us that وَالْأُجْرَةُ لَا تَجِبُ بِالْعَقْدِ. The pay or the rent in the ijara contract is not due by the contract itself. وَتُسْتَحَقُّ بأحد معان ثلاثة. Rather, it becomes due to any one of three meanings. إما بشرط التعجيل. One is by the condition of paying in advance. So you agreed to that condition. It then becomes due. أو بالتعجيل من غير شرط. Or you paid it in advance without making a condition. Now you can't take it back. أو باستيفاء المعقود عليه. Or by the delivery of what was agreed upon, because it's a contract of exchange, right? Right? Either, of course, this is, you can see in Majalla item 480, I believe, 470. It's also due, of course, by, in the Ujra al-Khas, the Ajir Khas, by making available the service that was contracted upon. Right? Such as, you hired a tutor for your child 2 days a week. Tutor went, sitting in the living room, kids didn't come down. Right? They made themselves available. This counts. Of course, one of the things to keep in mind is that these texts don't equip one. These are sort of just tools to understand. Right? And both sales contracts and hire contracts are things that people deal with all the time. And you cannot answer people's questions just based on general texts. There's so many scenarios. So in the case of my friend, for example, the issue that came up when people kept canceling on him was that once an appointment is made, it cannot be cancelled without customarily acceptable notice. Right? Otherwise, full payment is due. Someone cancels a day before, 2 days before, and what's considered in that is, unless there's an established custom, how much time would the person providing that service typically need to get an alternative appointment, right? So I forced my friend, and that's part of nasiha, because a friend is not someone who just tells you what you want. There's someone who tells you what you need. They don't tell you what is pleasing to you, but they tell you what is beneficial to you. So we sat down, we made a contract, and we stipulated that any cancellations made less than 72 hours in advance, or by mutual agreement, payment is due in full for them. Because there are some weeks, poor guy was just doing makeup hours for hours that had been cancelled, and that's dhulm. But the way you structure these contracts, recommend to structure the contracts in a way that keeps goodwill between the two parties. So sometimes one can explain. Because sometimes people, and when it was explained to them, a lot of the people hiring were like, oh my God, I should pay back for, no, nothing was said, but they realized, oh my God, they didn't realize that they're imposing a harm. Some kids, they're doing a grammar class, parents say, let's go, let's go. So okay, Shaykh Ali agreed to schedule the class later. But that's imposing harm on the person.
What's the difference between the first two?
No, بشرط التعجيل, by making a condition to pay in advance. We agreed that, okay, I rent this apartment for $1,200 payable in advance. Yeah, بشرط التعجيل. No, that in the contract, the تعجيل was specified. أو بالتعجيل من غير شرط, or it was just paid up. We didn't make a condition that you pay in advance. There's no condition, then it's due when the service is delivered. Right? Either, in the various scenarios. In the case of the tailor, when they finished the clothing. In the case of the employee, when they work the whole month, the salary is due at the end of the month. unless there's a custom to the contrary. In some industries, payment is made weekly, like so that, someone's working in the fast food industry or whatever, and let's say somewhere where they pay weekly, then what's customarily known is as if contractually stipulated. Okay. ومن استأجر دارا فللمؤجر أن يطالبه بأجرة كل يوم إلا أن يبين وقت الاستحقاق في العقد. If one rents a house for a known period of time, for a known amount, then the one who's renting out, the owner has the right to demand payment each day. Because the usage takes place each day. This is إلا إن كان العرف بخلافه, unless the custom is to the contrary. So in renting houses, in long-term rents, when is rent typically due? Monthly. It's like customarily known. Would anyone disagree? No. For short-term rent, it may be weekly, right? Depending on where you are, right? Unless one إلا أن يبين وقت الاستحقاق في العقد, unless one specifies the time when payment is due in the contract, which is superior, right? ومن استأجر بعيرا إلى مكة فللجمال أن يطالبه بأجرة كل مرحلة. If one hires a camel to Mecca, for example, then given that the one whose mount is being hired can demand payment for each known stage of the journey. But again, it's best to define how payment will be made. Right? Because on a long journey, if you only paid at the end, then the one who's renting out, they have expenses along the journey, etc. وليس للقصار والخياط أن يطالب بالأجرة حتى يفرغ من العمل. The tanner, the dyer or the bleacher cannot demand payment until they've completed their work. Because it's considered one unit of work. You say, well, I've now washed your clothes, give me 10%. I have now begun the bleaching process, give me 40%. Now the dye is setting. No, unless they agreed that that's how the payment would be. إلا أن يشترط التعجيل, unless what they agreed for advance payment or a taqsit, or that it be paid in installments. ومن استأجر خبازا ليخبز له في بيته قفيز دقيق بدرهم لم يستحق الأجرة حتى يخرج الخبز من التنور. If someone hires a baker to bake for them at their own residence, a qafiz, a certain amount of wheat, for example, for 1 dirham, the payment is not due until the bread comes out of the oven. Because the work's not complete until the bread comes out, right? Right? Because what if it gets burnt? Right? What if it gets burnt? Right? ومن استأجر طباخا ليطبخ له طعاما للوليمة فالغرف عليه. If one hires a cook to cook some food for a walima, then the serving is upon them, right? Upon the one who's hired. And this is based on urf. This is based on urf, right? وَيُنظَرُ فِي مِثْلِهِ إِلَى الْعُرْفِ. And in that one looks at the custom. That if let's say we're having a potluck dinner, we're having a catered dinner at Seekers. If we got food from entrepreneur cooking, would normally when you get food delivered from someone, are they expected to serve the food as well? No, right? So that depends on custom, right? And a lot of rulings are based on custom, and there's a beautiful and actually I stumbled upon the folder. If someone asks me, I'll share the recordings. I kind of triggered a fight, but a loving fight, a fight between friends, between two of my friends when Mufti Rafi Usmani came to Jordan. I think it was 2004, maybe 2005. Because Shaykh Badib is coming in a week or two. He wanted to read the beginning of end of Sahih Muslim to seek ijazah from Mufti Rafi. Dr. Salah wanted to just ask fiqh questions, because we don't meet a faqih like him too often in a country like Jordan. So I kind of provoked Sheikh Dr. Salah to raise we're in the car, that what's the point of reading hadith? It's just for barakah, right? Like what else is there? Right? Just gain the barakah on your own, right? That's because the rulings have been derived from hadith. So I sort of instigated it both ways, and I got Shaykh Badib. He said, no, but like, istijazat al-mashayikh. And Shaykh Badib's a big believer in that, for people of knowledge. And so we finally asked the question. And Mufti Rafi gave a beautiful answer. Because very important, like, you cannot just study the texts of fiqh divorced from deep knowledge of both the Quran and the Sunnah, because then otherwise you cannot distinguish what are rulings that the fuqaha derived textually. Because if it's textually derived, then the basis is that we're responsible for this. Absolutely. The Prophet ﷺ said this. Of course, fiqh interprets it, understands it, contextualizes it, etc. But أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول, obey Allah and obey in His Messenger. But then there are other rulings that are established on the basis of custom. That when the custom is sound, it's binding. And the custom specifies what is due on one party or what's due on the other, what's expected from both of them, like in this case. But this is not an absolute text. Like, I hire, or we hire, Sister Yasmin hires, and enterprising cooks, right? Mississauga's enterprising Classy Cooks Association, Mecca, right? One of your many businesses, right? So now Sister Yasmin says, you guys have to stay here because it says here in Quduri that you have to do the serving. And you look at it, you're like, astaghfirullah, because he had other jobs to finish, right? Says no, because that's what the text says, but as the commentaries explain, it's built upon custom, right? And custom can change. Yeah, and there's a legal principle related to that. So it's mentioned in Sharh Qudras, in Uqud Rasm al-Mufti of Ibn Abidin. للعرف في الشرع اعتبار لذا عليه الحكم قد يدار. Custom للعرف في الشرع اعتبار لذا عليه الحكم قد يدار. Custom is of consideration in sacred law, which is why rulings may revolve. And this qad is very important. May revolve around it, which is those rulings that are not textually established. They're not established by the primary texts. Yeah, they are contextual applications of principles established from. We saw that early on in sales, that if you buy a house, it's enough to see the saha, right? The open space of the house. You don't have to see the individual rooms. That was the position of Abu Hanifa and Abu Yusuf and Imam Muhammad. correct? But Imam Zufar said no, you have to see each of the rooms. Why? Because at the time of, certainly there's a position of Abu Hanifa, I forget the Sahibain. But Zufar later said no, because custom had changed. Before, each room used to be the same size. So it's not something that would lead to dispute. But there's no hadith about it. There's no primary text about it. So Mufti Rafi gave a very good answer. And one of the main aspects was, because otherwise you wouldn't know custom. And then the lax inclination would be that everything is contextual. Everything is based on custom, and people would just regard all of Sharia, which is not correct. Okay. ومن استأجر رجلا ليضرب له لبنا استحق الأجرة إذا أقامه عند أبي حنيفة. If one hires someone to make bricks for them, right? They deserve pay once they set them for them, right? Because you shape the brick, but then أقامه is that when they صار لبنا, once the brick is formed, because it has to be given time to dry, right? According to Imam Abu Hanifa. وقال لا يستحقها حتى يشرجه, right? And according to the Sahibain, it is not due until one stacks them, right? Because first the way they used to generally make bricks, they would be laid out until their basic form was made, and then they would be stacked. So that's the stacking would be from it. And the difference between the Imam and the Sahibain here is a difference of urf. What is the custom? As the commentaries mentioned, most of the later scholars said the fatwa is on the position of Imam Abu Hanifa's two students due to custom, right? So when working bricks, for example, basically, and especially when you're dealing with someone who's not in the industry, it's particularly important to specify these things. That, okay, when is payment due? So yeah, it's known customarily. But yeah, you may know it's known customarily because you work in the industry, but I'm new. So I don't know the custom, so we'll fall into dispute. Right? وإذا قال للخياط إن خط هذا الثوب فارسيا فبدرهم وإن خطه روميا فبدرهمين. Right? جاز وأي العملين عمل استحق الأجرة. If one says to the tailor, if you stitch this cloth in the Persian style, I'll give you 1 dirham, and if you stitch it in the Roman style, I'll give you 2 dirhams. This is a valid contract. And whichever of the two jobs they do, that one is binding. And this is conceptually like khiyarut ta'yin. We saw khiyarut ta'yin, the option of specification, where you say, Zubayr got married to Zubaydah, she has complex taste. So he wants to buy her a jilbab, but he's not sure which one. So he says, okay, let me take these 3 jilbabs. I'll buy one of them. This one's for $120, this one's for $160, this one's for $240. Expensive jilbabs, right? So this is valid, khiyarut ta'yin, the option of specification, right? They have the right to choose. One of these would be binding, right? And you can return the other 2. That can also be done in a service contract, right? So, for example, there's many other scenarios, right? You could say, okay, I'll paint your house if you wish me to paint it in this kind of paint. It'll be $2,200, and if you decide that I paint it with this other method, it'll be $2,500. So contract's binding, and one party can specify which of the 2 things that they do, right? وإن قال إن خطه اليوم فبدرهم وإن خطه غدا فبنصف درهم. Right? So if they said, if you stitch it in a day, you have 1 dirham, and if you stitch it by tomorrow, then you get half a dirham. This is problematic. This is problematic. Because it's not giving the option between the choice between two contracts. This is one contract with the payment being contingent upon time. Right? So there what happens? فَإِنْ خَاطَهُ الْيَوْمِ فَلَهُ الدِّرْهَمِ. If they stitch it the same day, they get 1 dirham. وَإِنْ خَاطَهُ غَدًا. Right? This second stipulation, Imam Abu Hanifa considered corrupt. Right? فَلَهُ So there, that second option was as if it was an option for which the price was not specified. فَلَهُ أَجْرُ مِثْلِهِ. And so it's a bit like the idea of qima, right? That in the fasad al-tasmiyah yusaru ila al-qima. When the price stipulated was not sound, one looks at the market price. So according to Abu Hanifa, there what would be due would be the market payment for that work. And how does one determine market price? By agreeing on an expert, on a valuator. Right? And the best thing to do is either to come to an agreement on what the market value is, if they can't, to agree on an expert. Right? Otherwise they have to take it to court. That becomes a problem. وَلَا يَتَجَاوَزُ بِهِ نِصْفَ الدِّرْهَمِ. But one would not go beyond half a dirham, because that they had agreed to. وقال أبو يوسف ومحمد الشرطان جائزان. Right? And according to Abu Yusuf and Muhammad, both conditions are valid. Right? And Imam Abu Hanifa's opinion was chosen here. If but this is a situation where if the urf corresponds to the opinion of the Sahibain, it could be taken. وإن قال إن سكنت في هذه الدار عطارا فبدرهم في الشهر وإن سكنت حدادا فبدرهمين جاز وأي الأمرين فعل استحق المسمى فيه عند أبي حنيفة. If someone says that if you rent this place and have if you rent this place to a perfume seller, then you can pay me a dirham. But if you rent the place to a haddad, to a blacksmith, then you have to pay 2 dirham. This condition is valid according to Abu Hanifa, and whichever of the two, the person renting ends up choosing, that's how much they have to pay for. Why? Because this is the same idea. You gave a choice between 2 contracts. You can either choose to rent it for the blacksmith, either as a shop or to live in. Right? So this is a choice between 2 contracts, right? وَقَالَ الْإِجَارَ فَاسِدَةً. And the Sahibain said it's not allowed because you don't, at the get-go, you don't know how much is due for the place. وَمَنْ اسْتَجَّرَ دَارًا كُلَّ شَهْرٍ بِدِرْهَمٍ. Here, this goes back to whoever rents a house each month for a dirham, then according to Abu Hanifa, فَالْعَقْدُ صَحِيحٌ فِي شَهْرٍ وَاحِدٍ. The contract is valid only for 1 month. فَاسِدٌ فِي بَقِيَةِ شُهُورٍ. And invalid for the remaining months. Why? Because we only يعني إلا أن يسمي جملة شهور معلومة, unless one specifies a known number of months. Because we don't know if we agree beyond that. So that's at the beginning, right? And this can lead to dispute. And contract renewal is a tricky matter, right? فإن سكن ساعة من الشهر الثاني صح العقد فيه. But if one dwells for a moment from the second month, then the contract becomes valid and binding in it. ولم يكن للمؤجر أن يخرجه منها إلى أن يقضي. And then the one renting out cannot demand the one renting to leave until the end of the month. And every subsequent month would be like that. So if you, according to Imam Abu Hanifa, you say, I'm renting you this place for 1,200 a month, every month for 1,200, then it's only binding for the 1 month. And then it kicks in for each month. But the problem with that is, at some point, the one renting will want to continue and the one renting it out will not want to continue. And that can lead to dispute. It is much better to agree to a clear time period and then renewal. And the same thing applies to contracts of hire. It's become very common to have open contracts in hire, right? You hire somebody to work, right? And companies don't want liability, so they don't give them a 1-year contract or whatever. They just hire on something called a rolling contract every month, and then we're on a rolling contract. That's fine. It's not impermissible, but it's far superior and far closer to taking care of the rights of the employee, particularly, but also for the employer, because now it's become popular to do ghosting, right? Where somebody just disappears on their employer, and the employer doesn't know, is the person still working or are they not? So they don't know, should I go hire somebody else? Or is this person still contractually with me? Right? So it's much better to agree to have a set period and then to have renewals. And sometimes in the reality of work, sometimes this can be tough, but it's certainly much, much better. Right? And where there are laws, one adheres to those laws. Right? وكذلك كل شهر سكن في أوله. And the same thing applies to each month, that they remain dwelling in it at the beginning of the month. And some said you can give a little extra time, you can read that. That returns to custom. That when is a notice considered reasonable? Right? You give 1 week notice, you give 1 month notice. It would appear that would depend on the type of contract. There's a yearly contract. Typically, you need to give a 1 month notice before the renter leaves. But if it was a month to month, then typically 1 week notice is considered sufficient, right? وإذا استأجر دارا سنة ب10 دراهم جاز وإن لم يسمي قسط كل شهر من الأجرة. If someone hires a property for a year for 10 dirhams, for example, this is valid, even if one does not name how much is due for each month, because it's implicitly known, right? And one would have to pay according to what's customarily expected. Now there's certain work that is allowed and not allowed. So he goes into that next. And so we'll complete the section on rent, on ijara next week, inshallah. And we'll touch upon some of the principles of permissible and impermissible work, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, because that's important. Because some of these are not, the actual issue is not like, we have to unpack them, but also see how they apply to different types of work in our times, right? So we'll stop there. Wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
How is liability determined if someone does the burning of the cloth, for example? How does the owner know if there was no ta'ati or taqsir?
That's a good question. Right? In which case?
In the case that the mushtarik.
Mushtarak. No. In which case? So in the ajir al-mushtarak, so cloth was given. There's two things. If the cloth perishes in his hand, there's one ruling. If it perishes during his work, there's another ruling.
But how would the other person know
that? That goes to the principle of claims. Right? And that's why it's amana, and that's why it's so important. Right? And one of the beautiful things, and I think Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad's talked about it, there's many books about it, that the professional guilds in Muslim societies were structured very similarly to the Sufi turuq. And there's a number of academics, there's books in Arabic about it, but there's also academic studies about it on professional guilds in Ottoman society, in Mamluk society, in different societies. Why? Because there's a good effort from the ulama and also from righteous traders that look, our work is based on trust. Trust requires moral grounding. So, they would make guilds that to be part of this guild. And there was also, in general, why would a business agree to a standard? Because it's good business. I think like for a while, if you look at the history of halal restaurants in Toronto, there's this whole problem, all these places that were going with machine slaughtered meat and this and that. But now increasingly people advertise, hand slaughtered zabiha. Why? Why would you pay for the more expensive thing? Because when given choice, people want assurance, right? So people, when they saw, if you look at purely economically, there's a moral imperative. When they saw that people are no longer trusting us, people are complaining about tailors are unreliable, etc. They say, look, if we get together and we start the Quality Tailors Association, right? Then if Entrepreneur Sister comes to the Mississauga marketplace, the Muslim Mall of Mississauga, Triple M, and there are these tailors, these are certified members of the Quality Tailors Association, and you have your tailor shop, you're not certified. Who is she going to go to? The certified, even if she has to pay more, because there's trust. Right? But then what are you going to do? After a while, you'll probably join the guild as well, even if you kind of didn't want to. There's a whole bunch of guys, and and they have annoying code of conduct and whatever, but you'll join, right? And there's very interesting principles related to that. For example, the fuqaha gave fatwa. It is not, I think it's mentioned in the Fatawa al-As'adi, it's not permitted to exclude someone from a guild. Some random person comes to the Mississauga Mall. What's it called? Muslim Mall of Mississauga, Triple M. So Sidiri comes and said, I want to set up a tailoring shop too. So we're not going to certify you because we're at quota. You cannot exclude the person. And they gave fatwa that you cannot exclude someone from your guild, right? Except with, there's a lot of classic fatwa on non-competitive practices. Because the people in the guild, just like, they put artificial quotas on the number of doctors and lawyers and engineers because they want to just make extra money. And that's unethical. That's unethical. But having those standards is very important, right? Having those standards is very important, and it's part of, restoring Islamic commerce. There's a very emotional but very good statement by the Mufti of Egypt, Mufti of Al-Azhar today. Did you see it? Oh, he went on a rant today. Yeah. Went on a good rant about, we were just, someone should translate that, inshallah. Sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. What? Good question. It's a good question. Yes?
Could we do the bab on ibadat?
You could.
What do you think of that suggestion?
From where? Oh, instead.
Ibadat?
But what about the rest of the chapters? They're abrogated? No. Let's sit down and plan it.
So, on the issue where the person gave two options to the contractor, said you finish it tomorrow, you get 2 dirhams. If you finish it 2 days from now, you get 1 dirham. So I don't understand how the second the second condition isn't considered, and yet he's not compensated for more than the amount that was named in the second condition. So it kind of is it considered or not? I'm a bit confused on this point.
You have to specify your confusion a little more. Let's take that offline, inshallah.